Hello, it's Tim from Fair Play Now, and I'm doing another one of my interviews, this time with Karen Churchill, who is a 5G campaigner. Hello, Karen, how are you?
Hello, Tim. I'm good, thank you. And yourself?
Yeah, good, thank you, good. So I thought what we would do is if you could just introduce yourself, say how you got into this 5G thing and what your concerns are about it, and we'll go from there.
Lovely, Tim. It was about in February 2019 that a friend of mine came to stay with me, and she was explaining how friends of hers were suffering effects from exposure to meters, and she was very well informed about the subject. And I hadn't heard about, these problems, and so I listened to her, and then she started telling me about this new technology and this new generation of mobile infrastructure called 5G, which again I hadn't heard of. And that's really the beginning of a journey which has turned into a full-time occupation because as one step led to another, I just became more and more passionate about finding clarity about what 5G is, how it's regulated, and then I exposed and very early on I followed a man called Chris Baker, who was getting advocating for the precautionary principle to be applied in Glastonbury. And I went to see a talk of his, and what he said made total sense. He talked about petitions that had been raised in America, calling for the precautionary principle because of the lack of testing of the new delivery type of 5G, and also on the basis that the previous generations were, the research was showing more and more just how many harmful adverse effects were arising from previous generations. So, and I do have a science degree, so I read a lot of the papers and took my time looking into the references that he'd given me and reading the appeals that were in progress. And I totally agreed with him that the precautionary principle did apply and we needed to slow down. I'm not against technology and advancement, but I just felt that we needed to slow down and really have a chance to examine what was being effectively imposed on us.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay, actually, what you said a minute ago leads me into nicely into just a bit of an explanation of what your background is before getting into all of this 5G thing. Uh, did you, before this, have a history of being an activist of any kind?
Oh, not at all. I wasn't a politically oriented person. My background is more of the healing side of things because of my own journey. I'd started off after my psychology and physiology degree. I went into computing. I became a systems analyst and went to Bermuda to work in a bank. And then I became very ill with myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, and that was interesting after being working with lots of VDUs around me. So to what extent that contributed to my sickness, I don't know. But it was interesting that it was after 9 years of working in that environment that I became sick. And that started my journey of looking into all sorts of healing modalities to look at improving my health. And so I came back from Bermuda and I went on to train as a vibrational medicine practitioner using flower essences. Um, so yes, and that was my main focus before coming across this 5G issue.
So I suppose with that background, you always had it tune, you're in tune with anything that could possibly cause ill effects and harm to the human body, I suppose. So, yeah, I suppose it
I
is.
was interested in anything that would restore immunity. I was looking at, the dietary aspect, the spiritual aspect, the mental positivity aspect, rooting out emotional blocks. But obviously with the training of the 2-year training, when we were trained in listening to the vibrational quality of the flower essences, it's a bit like homeopathy, but more subtle. And that was when I realized just how powerful subtle energy medicine is. And obviously the interrupting nature of EMFs in that communication and that subtle process of healing was of interest to me, and if there was any factor that was contributing to lowering immunity or affecting my nervous system, then I wanted to know about it. And previously to my friend visiting, I didn't know about it. And interestingly, my neighbor, her husband had a brain cancer, and her oncologist made the comment, between you and me, I think it's the mobile phones plays a part. And again, this interested me that there was this reluctance on his part to admit to that viewpoint. And when I looked into the research supports that viewpoint. There's even, court cases in Italy in the court of Turin where it's been ruled that acoustic neuroma was caused by mobile phone exposure. But early on in the campaign, this aspect of belief systems around the risk from wireless radiation was very embedded in the psychology through the media and in people's mind. I noticed very early on working with this just how much it was implanted in people's minds that to think there may be a problem, you very quickly were labeled as a tinfoil hatter,
Yes.
and that was very prevalent in the early days of talking about this subject. It's very difficult to get an open forum where you could sit down with a counselor or a doctor and look at the papers together and to discuss the research that was actually 11,000 papers and numerous reports from doctors and environmentalists that were not being addressed. So
Right. And you said plenty there, but there's going to be people. Well, there's lots of people out there, and some of them might be watching this interview who are sort of totally skeptical about the harms of 5G wireless radiation and other forms of mobile radiation as well. They're going to say, well, it's an advancement of technology, and I don't think there's any harm that comes from it. What else would you say, apart from the fact that there's oncologists talking about it, even if quietly? What else would you say to someone like that?
well, I think one places I start in that conversation, because there's many directions you could go, and it takes a long time to explore all the directions. But one of the statements or pieces of research that I find particularly compelling is that 95% of all research, both industry funded and independent, shows that wireless radiation causes oxidative stress. Now, oxidative stress leads to many health conditions, and it's an accepted mechanism for ionizing radiation to cause cancer. So if it's accepted as a mechanism in the ionizing field, then to my mind, and to also Dr. Erica Mallory Bry's mind, who's one of the doctors that I refer to most. She's on the board of the International Commission of Biological Effects, EMF effects, which I can talk about later. But it's not me saying it; it's her, it's the experts saying it. That it is therefore a known mechanism. And wireless radiation is classified as a possible class 2B carcinogen back in 2011. And in order for it to be reclassified to a probable or a definite carcinogen, more research was required. Well, that research was completed. The NTP study, which was £1 million study, multi-stage study in America completed, and it showed a definite causation of cancer in animals, schwannomas, and in the heart, and other cancers. So the IARC classification is due to be reviewed later this year. And from the results of the NTP study and a further study in the Ramazzini Institute, which repeated and found similar results to the NTP study, that this fact that wireless radiation is carcinogen is more verified than it was in 2011. So the classification is quite valid, that it should be classed as a probable carcinogen. So
Right.
that's just for starters, and
Yeah.
that's just for the cancer. But but I think that there's a very, very important area to bring in here, which is the topic of electrohypersensitivity, which is the label that's given to people that experience acute symptoms when exposed to wireless radiation. Now, since I've started becoming, involved in this subject, I've met numerous dear friends who have become dear friends who suffer with exposure immediately in the vicinity of wireless radiation. And my heart goes out to them because I know what it's like for when I had my symptoms of ME in the early days, before ME was accepted as a physical condition. I was labeled, oh, yuppie flu, and everyone thought I was just had all these sorts of judgments about my condition. Whereas over time, it's accepted that ME is a very real physical complaint. And I feel the same with EHS. The WHO and the government go as far as recognizing the symptoms, but they're still being very slow to acknowledge fully the physical condition of EHS. And people, they have, will experience nausea or palpitations or brain fog, fatigue, tinnitus, all of these symptoms coming together in the vicinity of either masts or mobile phones or routers. So it touches me deeply when these people are suffering to the extent, and yet there is no acknowledgement that they need areas where that are free of wireless radiation, and it's very difficult.
Indeed, yeah, I know. I actually knew a guy a couple of years ago who literally had to sell up his house and everything and get a motorhome and go out into the countryside, and he's been living in that for quite a few years, I think, from what I gathered, because he suffered so much from what we're talking about here. So must be
3 to 5% of the population, according to ESUK, that experience this condition, disabling and interrupting their quality of life.
Yes,
And,
so it's quite indisputable, isn't it? If there's 5% of the population who have got this condition and this sensitivity, so I'll ask you the question. I can probably guess the answer, really, but why is it, do you think, that the mainstream, the authorities, etc., are so slow to recognise this as a problem?
I think it's industry capture. If we look at the narrative around other pollutants, there's a pattern. If you look at smoking or asbestos, there's a risky subject comes, and then it takes years and years and years for the full extent of the risks to be acknowledged. And I think, with smoking, you've got a choice whether you smoke or not. With this, we don't have a choice when it's imposed in our environment.
Exactly.
And yeah.
Yes. Those examples. It took decades, didn't it, to
Yes.
go from where we
And
were.
it took court case after court case. And, they say that how they kept the narrative going so long is to create doubt about the science. And that's exactly what's happening with the science with wireless radiation. Dr. Kent Chamberlain, who was he was an engineer, but he was appointed onto a board of a commission in New Hampshire, along with epidemiologists and other experts. And over a year, they looked at all the information, and he's completely now an advocate for a 500-meter setback, because he realizes that, unbeknownst to him before, they're really the evidence. He says the science is in. And we've gone beyond the point where we can allow the ongoing narrative about, it being fringe science or disputable or debatable. Obviously, all science is a progression, and we're, one experiment leads to another, to a deeper and deeper understanding. But in his words, the science is in. Non-thermal effects that happen way below the current adopted guideline level, that has been proven and shown in epidemiology and in the lab to have harmful biological effects, which lead on to harmful health impacts. The industry like to distinguish, or the regulatory bodies, between what is a biological effect and what is a health effect. And the body admits that sometimes it's a fuzzy line, but nonetheless, you cannot use that fuzziness and these definitions to avoid taking responsibility for recklessly rolling something out without full and proper risk assessment.
Indeed, yeah. Okay, tell me a little bit more about your activism and what you've been doing, the setbacks you've had, the successes you've had.
Sure. Well, once I've been to Frome Council, and I did a talk in the town, and the deputy mayor came along, and we were able to put all the information on the table, and they voted to accept and adopt the precautionary principle. This was in late summer 2019. So I thought, super, that's progress. We've got some acknowledgement that precaution does apply in this case in relation to 5G. However, they warned us immediately, we're not a planning authority, and when it comes to the first mast coming into this town, there's nothing we can do. And the mantra was, you cannot refuse a mast on health grounds. And I was curious about this, which made me delve further, and I met up with friends in Bath and Bristol, and we went to the council and we asked questions. We raised another petition in Bath, and we went to a solicitor to investigate, the regulatory procedures and how is the precaution applied in law. And what is the regulatory procedure, and how do we, if we wanted to, how do we challenge that? And the Public Health England solicitor came back and explained that the ICNIRP guideline is just that. It's just a guideline, and local councils have to decide how much weight to put on that guideline when they make decisions, when they grant or refuse permission for the mast to go up. So I thought, oh, well, that's good. That's what we need to focus on. We'll go to the council, and we'll show them the evidence when a mast application comes along, and they will weigh it. And, I went to have a meeting with the leader, the now leader of Bath Council, and he said, oh, I was riveted. I was up since 7 a.m, and I've read all your information, and I can see why you think there's a problem. Perhaps we can help you be the first city to stand up to the telecoms and refuse this, challenge them about the safety of what they're doing. So months went by, and a mast came up in a sports field right by a football pitch with a sports hut. And there was actually 2 mast applications in the same field, 50 meters away from each other. And we found out there was such a thing as called an ICNIRP exclusion zone. Now, this is an area around a mast when the formed the certificate to this guideline. But where is it? It was only through private investigation that I even found out there was such a thing. And it was only looking at comparative diagrams that we could guess roughly where it might be. So I discussed this with Councillor Kevin Guy, and he agreed that it was a reasonable request to know where this exclusion zone fell. And he ended up speaking for us at the planning board meetings, saying, well, really, it's not reasonable to go ahead if we don't know where this exclusion zone is, because are the children going to be safe or not? And the master was refused, and all a lot of kickback, for want of a better word, happened after the meeting, because also the Bath MP, Wira Hophouse, she objected on the grounds of potential health effects as well. And the Lib Dems were furious. There was absolute mayhem. A very damning report was put in The Guardian and on the online Lib Dem forum. There was a lot of criticism of Kevin and Sarah, the Lib Dems in Bath, who'd refused on health grounds, as of Vera. So when the next mast application came along, they retreated, and they wanted to push through the next mast without any fuss, because this attention had proved very detrimental to them. But we were given an exclusion zone diagram for the next mast under Bain's authority for a house in a mast in Radstock.
Right.
Now, this mast was a 4G to 5G upgrade, and the antenna was in direct line of sight of a gentleman's home. And we looked at the diagram, and his house was completely inside an exclusion zone, and the zone is labeled safe only for a maximum of 8 hours. Now,
Wow.
the gentleman that lived in this house, he was 3 people in the house, all suffering insomnia, anxiety. There was 9 houses in the row, and later in time, he shared with me that there was multiple cancers along this row of houses. And it was a very difficult situation, because it was very difficult to be party, to be the one that was sharing information that this could well be the 4G mast that is causing his health problems, before he's now facing being exposed to an upgrade to a 5G mast. And the council were not listening to any of his concerns about being inside this public exclusion zone. There's a policy within the National Planning Policy Framework which basically says that councils must not set health safeguards other than ICNIRP. And they accept a certificate, they don't examine the zones, and as long as they've got the certificate, they feel that they can't do any more than tick the box, and away we go. So we went directly to the company that created the zones, and what they did was they changed the map to turn it down for a 4G map, but the mast was still approved on the basis of 5G. Now, this was horrendous. So we complained, and they said, well, it's Ofcom who are the authority, the regulators. So we wrote to Ofcom, and we got no joy whatsoever. Their offer was, well, we don't have anything to do with planning, but what we can do is come and measure after it's been erected, and then see whether it's a breach of ICNIRP or not. So
Right. So
I was not happy. He was not happy. This was whether ICNIRP is a good enough guideline or not. At least those guideline levels should be adhered to, and that has led to a very long path to where I am now, which is taking a case against the government with my colleague Neil McDougall, who's got a planning background, and we've tried every alternative dispute resolution mechanism to address this issue of the local authorities' scope of risk reconciliation. We've asked questions both in Mendip, in Baines, in Solihull, and Solihull have asked government, well, what is the extent of our responsibilities as planners in terms of risk reconciliation? And Matt Warman, the MP for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, we went to him, or Vera Hobhouse did on our behalf, and we asked him, what are the responsibilities of the planners in terms of risk reconciliation? And he didn't clearly answer the question. So this lack of clarity has led to the action that we're now taking, because what we found was in the European directive, which backs up English planning law, there's a recital called Recital 106, and this directly assigns the role of risk reconciliation of health and environmental effects with the local planners. But the government have failed to tell the local authorities that they have this role. They are actually restricting them from performing that role by setting this policies that says you must not set health safeguards other than ICNIRP without requiring examination of the public exclusion zones.
Right, there's quite a lot of shocking things you said there. Actually, the fact that the political pressure put onto those by the councillor and the MP in your area, which sort of forced them to backtrack. So there's a lot of political pressure, which is quite shocking, really. You'd have thought if there's people with concerns, people would be, well, okay, let's hear your concerns, not sort of taking this horrendous, no, just shut up and stick with the narrative kind of approach. So that's, yeah, well, it's shocking, but shouldn't be quite so shocking, I suppose, in light of what's been going on in over the last few years, etc. But is there anywhere internationally where they're a bit more sort of hot on this kind of thing, making more progress on this, or not?
Well, in the US, they had a court case. I think it finished in 21. I'll have to check my dates on that. But the regulators were taken to court, and it was found that they were not taking into account people with EHS. The guidelines had not been constructed with a consideration of the evidence of EHS, electrohypersensitivity, or with a consideration of the non-thermal effects. The non-thermal effects being effects that happen at a lower exposure than the guidelines that were adopted, which are mainly based around the health effects that arise from the heating effects of the wireless radiation. So that result was a real breakthrough. But since that decision, they haven't actioned it. They haven't adjusted. They haven't done the research. They haven't produced another report. So I think the legislators over there are looking to go back to court to look for an enforcement of that decision. We did take the case, the first case that I was involved with was two other claimants, and Michael Mansfield was our lead barrister. And that was a direct challenge to our government for not risk assessing separately from ICNIRP and taking into account, the vulnerabilities of children, for example, and the elderly. Because ICNIRP, who set the guidelines back in 22, they thought that they would have to set another guideline for children because they have, during their growth period, different vulnerabilities to pollutants of all kinds. And the absorption from mobile phone is going to be very different. The constitution of their brain tissue is different, the amount of radiation absorbed, but they have not catered for children, basically. And even the professor, James Lynn, ex-ICNIRP member, is saying that the current guideline is not suitable for children. So we gave Michael Mansfield all this information, and he was very moved by it. And we put together a 1,000-page document, at least, with the reports from experts explaining this issue. And the courts decided that they couldn't get involved in disputable science. It wasn't their role. Their role was to look at the, administrative decisions. And so we weren't successful in using that mechanism to enforce the government to risk assess.
I suppose the next question to ask you is, where do we go from here? What are the things that we can be doing to bring this issue, to give it greater awareness among the public, and secondly to stop getting the masks sort of put up?
Well, we've got a fantastic website called rfinfo.co.uk, which is run by a superb campaigner called Oliver Percival. And we have a lot of templates available on that website for anybody who wants to object to a mask, and we're keeping them up to date all the time as our legal arguments develop, which is fantastic. And in the last 2 years, as of 2 months ago, the UK have stopped 68% of all masks. And in Bristol, I think it's even a higher percentage. It's like 80%. There's a very active campaigner in Bristol who looks at the portal. As soon as one comes along, she prints leaflets, she informs people. A lot of the time we're finding that neighbours are not consulted. There may be a site notice up that's up for a short period of time, or 1 or 2 houses are informed. But oftentimes when I've been out campaigning, you knock on the door and they have no idea that there's a mask application due from right outside their house. So one of the things that people can do is watch their planning portal and search for words like mast, antenna, telecoms, monopole in the planning search terms, and keep an eye once a week and to make sure and see what's coming on. And if you do see a mast, then use the materials on RF Info to inform the local people. Obviously, we would love your support in supporting the 2 judicial review processes, the legal cases we've got going. Stephen Thomas in Cheltenham is doing a fine job preparing for his case with Neil on April the 11th, and the hearing will be in Cardiff Court. I can send you the detail. Cardiff Administrative Court.
Please do. Yes.
Due to start around 9:30, but a physical presence there would be very supportive indeed, and it would be informative to people as to why the local authorities are avoiding this. Because of this policy from the government, we are holding the local authority to account for not risk assessing. In Stephen's case in Cheltenham, again, there's a mast 17 meters from a 5-story block of flats. So the head of the antenna is pointing in this lady's bedroom, 17 meters from where she's sleeping and where she's living.
Yeah.
And again, the council were asked to examine the exclusion zone, and they deny that they have any responsibility because the government aren't insisting that they check, and they don't think they need to check. But in the face of this logic, I can't help but be frustrated that, we can't lose sight of this basic logic in this clouded debate about whether or whether not the guideline is sufficient. To start that question, we have to apply the guideline we've got, and we have to apply it before it goes up. After it goes up, it's too late. It's unacceptable that people have to move houses and, try and protect themselves with canopies and tents because of this recklessness of not checking. And going back to Kent Chamberlain, I was talking about from the New Hampshire Commission, they found that the lab science and the epidemiology both point to the necessity of around 500 meters setback to protect against cancers and acute symptoms. And this distance, even 2 years before, was acknowledged by an engineer in America who was advising the telecoms company that it's going to get very expensive for them in claims if they don't acknowledge this setback. So from both sides, this ex-telecoms engineer, Kent Chamberlain, and from this insurer and other engineers, it's just from all avenues, the awareness is growing that this greater setback is needed, greater than the roughly 50 meters of the ICNIRP setback is around 50 meters, the exclusion zone, the public exclusion zone.
It sounds like things are gathering pace on this all, the awareness of it. And sorry, did I catch that right? In certain areas, at least, 80% of the MAST applications have been sort of refused.
Well, we have a very active campaigner in Bristol who's been working for a long period of time, but the councils seem to be varying in their acceptance of the procedures required around the notification, the interpretation of what a prior approval application requires, process-wise varies from council to council. It varies to what extent they feel they need to consult. It varies what factors they take into account. Gloucester is past 40 masts with only one set of objections being displayed on the planning portal. So we have campaigners in there questioning Gloucester Council about their procedures because their results are showing that really it looks like mass fraud. Because, 4 of them, they've admitted, oh, yes, we didn't follow procedure, we were under pressure for various reasons, but the rest of them, they are not following procedure in a way that other councils are.
Right.
In Brighton, we took a judicial review against Brighton when they approved a mast outside a school. And again, there was an issue that the exclusion zone diagrams weren't available. And they did concede and they had to pay £13,000 because they agreed that they hadn't assessed the proximity of the mast to the school. Now, the complication there was that they lowered the mast halfway through the application and they didn't have a certificate for the second mast. So, but if they had have had a second certificate, they wouldn't have had any more information about the safety of the proximity to the school. So again, these layered, nuanced admissions and concessions have to be understood and seen for what they are. They need to see those exclusion zone diagrams to determine in the first instance whether those children are safe. Which leads me on to another story.
Yes.
Matt Warman, who was one of the defendants in the action against 5G case, as the Department of Culture, Media and Science, Sport. I get that last S wrong, but he again was in his constituency. A mast was passed outside a school, and his residents were not happy. Instead of looking to correct the procedural risk assessment processes that should be in place, he went and rang the telecoms company CEO and asked him to not put the mast up. So he pulled favour with EEE, then put a post on Facebook being proud of the fact that he'd satisfied his constituents' request and admitted that placing masts outside school is a sensitive issue, but then tried to claim that we've got safety in hand. Now, to me, that is absolutely unacceptable. Not everybody council has got a Matt Warman who can ring up EEE and get them to change their minds after a mast has been approved. Exactly. And the other issue is, why are part of the planning process requires consultation by school. If there's a school nearby, their school is consulted. But if the school objects, they still think there's no provision to refuse on the grounds of protecting the children on health grounds. So why consult the school? And also, children at home are equally vulnerable as they are at school, especially when they're sleeping at night, when the body repair mechanisms are working. So there's another inconsistency, to my mind, in the process and in the logic of how these masks are being processed. I think there was one other thing I was going to say about that. Oh yes.
Yes.
Sorry if I'm talking too much here, but
No, that's all right. I tend to let people run, really. So please go ahead.
yeah. In Mendip, the first mask that came along in Frome, what the council, having voted for the precautionary principle, decided to revoke their precautionary principle on the grounds that people were more in need of connectivity since COVID. And we went ahead with 200 objections to the council, and we asked them lots of questions about their jurisdictional obligations under the EEC before the meeting. And we arrived at the planning meeting, and the case officer said that those obligations could be fulfilled by applying policy. But we asked the question, was it legal to and a valid decision to refuse on health grounds? And they said yes. If a threshold of evidence is reached, then yes, you can go against policy. Well, in that case, they agreed, and they could see that this issue about children being not consulted at their home, but the school was consulted. And we also had an example in that case where a man with EHS with multiple metal implants in his head lived close to the mast, and Dr. Erica Mallory Blythe testified, and she said his health would likely be adversely affected if the upgrade to 5G went ahead. So they looked at all things considered, and they decided that there wasn't enough evidence of safety, and they did refuse the mast on health grounds. And to my knowledge, that is the only mast of all the ones we've seen being processed that has been properly assessed for risk with the evidence on the table, and they made a decision to refuse. So what happened then was the telecoms withdrew the application. So that meant it wasn't on record officially that it had been refused.
Right.
So that was interesting.
That is, I wonder if it's sort of on record that it's been refused on health grounds. How on earth can they be allowed to, pull it off the record, as it were?
It's in the minutes, but it's not in the decision notice. And we went to get some legal advice about that, because it seemed that decision in planning law should be recorded in the decision notice. But the other thing to say about Frome Council, I went to the hustings about 6 weeks after this decision. And from stage, all members of all parties were claiming that they needed to look again at the precautionary principle, and maybe they'd made a mistake about revoking the precautionary principle. And they claimed that they had been party to the refusal, which was not true.
Right.
And then I contacted 3 of the councillors on stage 3 times, and I followed up with the Royal Society of Medicine talk by Erica and the International Commission. I've had no response.
Yeah, I did actually see a talk by Dr. Erica there, and also Kent Chamberlain as well. He was in Wimbledon about 9 months ago, and I saw a talk with him there, and then Erica came on. She's really good, isn't she? She sort of really presents the case for all of this concern really well, doesn't she?
Really highly recommend. Of one source of information is the icbe-emf.org and their webinar that was filmed in London at the Royal Society of Medicine last June in the same series of talks that you attended in Wimbledon. There's three videos to watch. It's completely comprehensive. It's rooted in deep science. Her knowledge is phenomenal and her presentation is clear and understandable. There is no reason not to hold back from this subject, thinking that it's complicated and it's debatable. One viewing of Dr. Erica's talk and Kent's and David G in combination, then it's a trusted, credible, deep source of logical and scientific information.
I'll check those out. Yes, please, if you can send the links, and I'll put them in the show notes under this video as well. So I'd appreciate that, Karen. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're making progress. It seems, you know, if it wasn't for all of this campaigning and activism, there would be considerably more masts up by now, wouldn't there? From what I can see anyway. So it is important to for us to keep campaigning, to get out there. And I think there are lots of people up and down the country who are doing so. Do you know Asif from 5G in Merton?
He's a wonderful, wonderful informed campaigner. His knowledge about the environmental effects is exquisite. He's really explored the energy impact of 5G and can talk very authoritatively about that, which is really good. And to come back to the case that I'm bringing with Neil, you know, we're holding the government to account for the not resourcing the local authorities to assess the health and the environmental impacts. You know, ICNIRP guidelines do not cover environmental impacts in any way, shape or form, whether it's the energetic or the biological impact to our pets, our farm animals, insects, bees. And there's growing evidence of harm to all life forms, but especially the millimeter waves from 5G are very short, and when it's resonant with the length of the insect body, it increases the absorption of the wireless radiation even more. And there's all sorts of mechanisms that the insects use to pollinate. For example, the transfer of the pollen from the flower across onto the leg. There's thought to be an EMF element to that, which could be disturbed by the wireless radiation. There's so much more research that needs to be done to refine our understanding, and the government dismiss the effects on wildlife and birds. They're saying because the studies aren't population-wide, which is, again, it's a dismissal of the evidence that we do have and a lack of commitment to furthering our understanding. And where's the precaution? You know, ICNIRP in their annual reports have only just started to acknowledge that, oh, we're going to set up a committee to look at the environmental effects and to see whether we need a guideline, and if and how we set a guideline. Well, you know, we're 4 or 5 years into rolling out this technology. Why now? It's too late, hence the need for precaution.
Exactly.
And this is what we want to be able to argue at the local level, because it's when the permits are issued or where the contracts are signed for the small cell technology, that is at the moment that we're giving permission for that radiation to be switched on, for that carrier to use that bandwidth. So the government have said, yes, in principle, roll it out, and in principle, use this guideline. But it seems, and what Neil was very much focused on, is when in law is that permission granted? And what he's found is it's at the local level at the moment that that permission is given, that that approval is granted, that the risk and the impact of that particular placement of the infrastructure on the surrounding area needs to be fully assessed. So our case, we have 21 remedies which people can read about either on RF Info, or there's a blog on safetechinternational.org. And in that blog, you can have full access to our 84-page submission with all the legal arguments. And in particular, in Appendix 2, there's a list of all the information that we believe the local authorities should have before they make a decision, all the information that they should be aware of. And that leads me on to talk about the auditory limit.
Mm-hmm.
Within the IGNAP guidelines, in footnote 7 on table 4, there's a very small note about a guideline level to protect the public from microwave hearing, which is described as a popping, clicking, and buzzing. How that overlaps with tinnitus as a label for an auditory effect isn't completely clear, but a lot of wireless radiation studies do report people reporting tinnitus as a symptom for living near a mast or being exposed to wireless. So this limit has not been recognized by the government, Ofcom, or the local authorities. The Ofcom states that nowhere across the country has ever an IGNA limit been breached. They have surveys that they've done in the last few years, and all the measurements in various locations in these surveys are reported on the Ofcom website. However, those reports measure against the basic limit. Now, the auditory exposure limit is 0.5% of that limit. Right. So therefore, in 3 places, Canary Wharf, Hatfield, and one other that slipped my mind for the moment, in those places, we have seen a breach of this auditory limit. Now, this auditory limit's expressed in a different unit to the basic limit. So luckily, I was being informed by a technician in Ireland who's helped me do the calculations to translate this auditory limit into a unit that is more recognized. So in other words, we've got a hidden exposure guideline within the guidelines that the public are not informed about, and it's not being monitored and measured. So that's very important that people know about that, and then they can challenge their local director of public health. And we are challenging the Secretary of State for Health in our legal case as to why is this limit not being recognized. And again, there's another part to the story in the sense that this limit has been taken out of the 2020 guideline compared to the earlier IGNAP guideline. And they're saying, well, actually, it's just a biological effect. But in their notes accompanying the guideline, they're saying, well, it can lead to a health effect if it's experienced over time, because it's stressful to be experiencing this effect. And also, the limit is still within the 1999 guidelines, and it's the 1999 guideline that this certificate is compliant to. So we still have this opportunity to challenge the government and the local authorities to say, come on, what about this limit? How are you calculating it? How are you measuring it? And how are you protecting us against this limit?
So this sounds like there's quite a lot of tools in the cupboard there to fight this in various ways. So we just need to use those tools, and I think we have power in numbers, and we need to get people out there doing what you're doing, really, and what the others you've mentioned are doing already.
Thanks, Tim. Absolutely. Power in numbers. That's exactly what one of the Bristol Green councillors said to me early on. We went and we presented this information at the council, and afterwards he said, well, I really agree with you. He said, but come back to me when you have numbers. That was his exactly words. He said, you have to choose your battles. And he said, if you have numbers behind you, then I'd listen and I'd campaign for you. Now that's wrong. It's either harmful or it isn't. If it's harmful and we're telling you, we've now informed you, you're our public servant, he should be representing the issue irrespective of numbers. That's what I think. But, you know, fair enough. We can, yes, it's helpful if we all stand up, we all write a letter, we all turn up to the council, we can all go and keep asking the questions. I think one thing I've noticed is persistence, that, you know, the more people who are offering the same information and asking for accountability, that's what we want. You know, I think 5 years in, I'm getting a little bit frustrated, you know, that it's you know, you're given 3 minutes, you know, you write your letter, and the content of the letter, the content of objection, and the content of the science has not responded to. And even with, you know, our Michael Mansell case, when we've laid out the science in great detail, then the court says, oh, we can't look at the science. Well, who's going to look at the science? You know, and we need decision makers at all levels, whether it's a ward councillor in a parish, whether it's a city councillor or a director of public health. Or, you know, recently we've been working with the church in Glastonbury High Street, because they are about to renew, or they have a new contract to renew the contract for their mast in the spire. We've been informing them about the effects. Now the church said, oh, we follow policy. If there's any evidence at a future time, we'll have a look. And I say, well, the time is now. Here is the evidence.
Exactly.
You know, you have to listen to this talk from the Royal Society of Medicine, and here is, you know, 51 pieces of evidence. You don't have to be a scientist to observe the logic of how this science and the lack of testing for 5G, on top of the depth of understanding we have about the effects of 4G, to examine and see that there's a risk here that needs to be addressed. We can't rely on the policymakers. We have to take individual responsibility to discern the information for ourselves and take action once we're informed.
Exactly, yes. So this video helps to get the word out and for people to take action. That'll be a good night's work, won't it, Karen? Really.
Thanks, Tim. Well, it's great to have the opportunity to tell stories.
Yeah,
and
I'm pleased to hear them, and you know, get the information out there for you. And is there anything else you'd like to add as well?
Put me on the spot there. I think I've covered quite a bit tonight, so maybe I'll leave it there. But I will say that there is a GoFundMe for our case, which I'll ask you to put in there underneath. Yeah, the government are fighting us on cost capping at the moment. They're claiming that our case isn't an environmental case, which is surprising, but not surprising. But it means that if we can't get cost capping, the cost of the defence so far is £28,000. So our GoFundMe is around 5,000 at the moment. We're very grateful to all the supporters that supported us so far. But we started with a target of £10,000. But we do need to break through this latest challenge to us from the government about cost capping, because we truly believe that this is an environmental case and that the Our House Convention does apply, and therefore our costs should be capped at £5,000. But this is a case for everybody. It's a case about our rights, saving our rights to have an input in where these masks are and why we don't want them, not just on how ugly they are, but just on the grounds that the impact to certain people in certain places mean that they shouldn't be placed in close proximity to residents. And we need to fight for our right to object.
Indeed, indeed. So if someone's sitting at home there, wondering what they can do to, they've got these concerns about 5G, etc., and they want to help. I think to recap, you were saying earlier that they should check their local planning portal once a week, go to your resources if they see an application, and use your templates, etc., and to really just get into the councils, or at least submit those to the councils to hopefully get more of these rejected.
Absolutely. Yeah. And every £5 on our GoFundMe makes a big difference. We really do need support, Tim. So
Thank
we
you.
worked for 5 years for as volunteers, and we really do need the support now to carry on this fight.
Is there any closing thoughts, Karen?
Just a big thank you, Tim, and I look forward to maybe bringing you an update in a couple of months' time with what's happened in Cheltenham and how our case is progressing, if you'd like me to do that.
I would indeed. Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Karen. It's been a very interesting and entertaining chat, and a lot learned there, I think. So thank you very much.
Super, Tim. Thank you.